Hi. So this is the PowerPoint that's on Asian Feminist Theology, an introduction. That's by Kwok Puilong. And again, I'm going to run the video while I play the PowerPoint. So I'm going to figure that out. All right. So thank you for your patience while I figure this out. All right. Let's go. This is a PowerPoint on Asian Feminist Theology. We are going to focus our work on Asian Feminist Theology in this course on this book that Kwok Puilong has written. It's an overview of a variety of different Asian theology, Asian Feminist theology, but obviously she's writing it, so it's going to focus on much of her perspective and her experience. The PowerPoint itself I've created to help you as you're reading through the book. It's meant to be something that you look at maybe before you read or as you're reading to give you a sense of what I think are the key themes and to help focus your reading and to make sure that you, I'm highlighting the issues and points that I think are particularly important. Here we have a picture of Kwok Puilong. We see that she was born in Hong Kong in 1952. She was born into a family that practiced traditional Chinese medicine or Chinese religion, but then she converted to Christianity later on. She currently teaches theology at Candler School of Theology, and that is in Atlanta, Georgia. She highlights in this book, Introducing Asian Feminist Theology, the diversity and the complexity, the diverse context of Asian feminist theology. Asia is a large continent, and it has many countries and many different cultures. And each of those cultures has a different context, a different experiences. Women and men have different experiences in these different cultures and different contexts. And there are a variety of different religions. And one of the things that is particularly interesting and intriguing and perhaps unique in this Asian context of doing theology is that there's a lot of different religions, and people don't usually, it's not unusual for people to identify with more than one religion. People often will say, I'm Chinese traditional religion and Christian. I practice Shintoism and Buddhism. So this adds a lot to the uniqueness or the distinctiveness, I should say, of the Asian religious context. And she highlights this, and we'll see how it impacts some of the implications for her critique, but also her constructive theology. And we'll see also that it plays out in her interest in interreligious dialogue. The second thing that I want to highlight here is the importance of her post-colonial identity. Many of the countries in Asia have been colonized by powers in the West. And this colonization brought with it Western norms and Western values and assumptions that Western ways of being in the world, Western philosophy, Western religions, Western cultures were superior to the indigenous or even the dominant Asian cultures. Christianity, unfortunately, brought with it often a highlighting of Western values as well as Christian theology. In fact, it's really difficult to separate the two. So for her, the post-colonial identity is really important. It is a critique of this notion of the superiority that often, of the West, that often is internalized. This is very similar to the way that male superiority becomes internalized for women, and requires a kind of feminist consciousness raising for folks to be able, for women in particular, to be able to recognize that we often ourselves participate in our own oppression by assuming that men and male values, male gender values, male gender roles are, and male ideas and voices are better or should be listened to or are more important. The post-colonial identity critiques both of these, the colonial values as well as the male values. She talks about also how Asian women are often criticized as falling into a Western norm of feminism when they ask for and desire independent voice, because traditional Asian culture maintains a male superiority and the subjugation of women in many cases. Feminist Asian theology also focuses on, or addresses, I should say, sexual violence and systemic exploitation of women and sex workers. She also looks at the way that feminist theology, and particularly in Asia, there is attention to context to engage different sources, experience, and also a hermeneutic of biblical scholarship. And we will take a look at that, and I encourage you to look at that particularly and to articulate it. And lastly, I wanted to highlight that Asian women, she believes, should develop their own theology and their own methods, not following the male norms or following Western white feminism. And here we have
Here, there are several pieces that are really helpful. I think if you want to take a look at them, you can see how, I think these are also on your lessons.
Miriam have co-professor of
Here
theology and spirituality.
there she is talking.
We revolutionary, unconventional, faith.
Anyway, so you can go ahead and click on any of those and get a little more information from her, about her and from her. It's nice to hear her talk.
In her discussion of different philosophical claims and questions, the changing Asian contexts and the variety or the breadth of Asian contexts, the fact that 70% of Chinese people are farmers and still use water buffalo to till the land, as well as so many of the large cities in Asia, so many large cities in Asia with skyscrapers and quite compact in terms of population in China and in Tokyo, for example. And they're very global, these cities, very global in the sense of having interaction with different cultures and different countries around the world. This brings up the philosophical issue of truth. What do we mean by truth? And we'll see that this is a big question in feminist theology in general. Is truth something with a capital T? Is there one truth? One way of thinking about it is there's one truth, and some people know what that truth is, and usually it's the people claiming what that truth is. Other philosophical claims would suggest that there may be one truth, but none of us have a corner on it, that each individual or each culture or each religion's truth is actually a small t approaching the large T. Kwok Puan is suggesting that truth is perspectival, and we'll see this in other feminist theological claims, especially in, we saw it in Creating Women's Theology and Process Theology, the notion of truth as being perspectival and definitely influenced by its context. We'll also see a similar issue, which has to do with essence versus constructed and relational identity. Do we have an essence? are women essentially distinct from men? That's one question. Another question is each individual have an essence that they've just lost and are trying to get to? Or is gender constructed? And who we are we in the process of becoming who we are becoming? And that essence is not set either at the beginning of life or before life in some sort of Aristotelian or Platonic form, but rather we transform and become who we become in the midst of our context and relationships with other people, and how our experiences can change us. She goes on to talk about how for her, there is no essential norm of Christianity, nor is there an essential norm in Asian culture or religion. That there are a variety of values and contexts. Another theme that she addresses in her discussion of philosophical claims has to do with who has the authority, or the authoritative sources, and who has the authority to say what those sources say and what the implications they are there for our theological claims. Who gets to write theology? Again, she focuses on and highlights the fact that in the Asian religious context, the plurality and dual religious identities are normative. Religious commitments don't usually compete against each other, but rather they dovetail together. And each person has perhaps a unique way of dovetailing different religious identities and claims together. The last issue that I want to highlight in this slide is, for her, a priority of well-being for people, not a priority of integrity of the doctrine. So what's important is the well-being of people, not this is what the doctrine should say, and it has to say it at all costs. So the next section in the Asian feminist theology is the method. The question of what are the authoritative sources, and those include the Bible and experience. They also include context and looking for elements in traditional religions of Asia that can be liberating elements for women. She's particularly insistent that women, Christian feminists or feminists in general in Asia, focus some of their work on recovering such elements. She notes that many of the scholars that study traditional Asian religions are men, and thus they typically ignore elements that are actually liberating for women. Her criteria for judging authoritative sources is this source liberating for women? And how to interpret a source in a way that can be liberating for women is important for her. She makes the statement that in talking about biblical authority, that Asian women are the text and the Bible is the context. This is different from what we usually think, and I wonder how you understand that statement. Further, when she's talking about experience also as an authoritative source for women, Asian women, she names that women's experiences are different from men. Like saving, she's going to assert that women's experiences are different than men. This is not making a claim of essential difference versus constructed difference, but that the experiences simply are different. The standpoint of women is different, and our way of knowing and thinking about things are different. She does believe that experience is constructed and that all reality is interpreted, all knowledge is interpreted through our experience. And in this slide, we're going to talk about women's experience. Kwok Pulong talks about the importance of experience and context in feminist theology, Asian feminist theology, but in feminist theology in general. And I would like us to note that this is an important theme that will go throughout the course. We've already seen it in the work in creating women's theology, the importance of experience. Sabine raised it, and I asked some questions about that in that book. The question comes up with, one of the questions that is raised is about the nature of women's experience. Do women have an essence that's different than men? Is there something absolutely distinct between men and women in terms of their spirit, in terms of their mind, in terms of their being? Is experience, women have different experiences than men, perhaps because of some sort of biological reality, perhaps because of some sort of philosophical essence, perhaps because of the context and the effect of gender roles and norms? Is this experience socially constructed and interpreted, or is it something that's essential? Is it that women just have a different wiring to their brain? Or is this something that we've constructed? We'll talk more about gender and how we understand the difference between sex and gender when we get to talking about Origoride later on. And there's a short YouTube video explaining Judith Butler's notion of gender as performative. I think it's really helpful. If you'd like to take a look at that now, you can. It's in the lesson under Origoride. Next, how do women know? Do women know things in a different way? Women's Way of Knowing is a name of a book that an author argues that actually women do have a different way of knowing. It's more relational and communal. I wonder what you think of that. That's Tangelo. And perhaps women's experience is shaped by our context of oppression, our context of being subjugated. Women are oppressed and subjugated and dominated in a variety of different ways and to a variety of different degrees. And we'll explore that as well as we go through the texts. It has a lot to do with everybody's context, each person's context. So in general, the question of experience, women's experience, and whether how different it is or why it's different from men's experience really comes down to perhaps the question of nature versus nurture. I encourage you to reflect upon that in your own thinking. And in this slide, we talk about biblical interpretation from Asian feminist perspective, both in terms of what different Asian feminists are, what methods they're using to engage and interpret the Bible, what are their different hermeneutics, but also, or what are the common hermeneutics that many Asian feminists are using, but also what they should be using. I'd like you to spend a bit of time on this chapter and think about how she's talking about the Bible. Think about it in terms of being constructive, but also critical. Does this way of thinking about the Bible help you engage with the biblical text? And what does she do with biblical texts that seem to go against Rosemary Radford Ruther's principle of critical theology, or critical principle of feminist theology, that a theological text or a biblical text or a claim is judged authoritative if it promotes the full humanity of women. And if it does not promote the full humanity of a woman, then there ought to be something to be, this signals that there's something to be critiqued and evaluated critically, what's going on here in the text. this comes from a theological assumption from Ruther particularly, that God does not think women are not human, but rather thinks that both male and female are human, and loves both sons and daughters. Moving on to Kwok's view, she suggests that we look at the role of women in the Bible. What different roles do women play, and to highlight those stories that have women in them. And sometimes the women are the heroines, sometimes they're the villains, but sometimes they're not even mentioned. I mean, there's women there, but they're maybe not named, or maybe it seems like they're not important, but they are there. So what do we make of that? She takes a look also at a hermeneutic of suspicion using the post-colonial hermeneutic. She's concerned that the post-colonial hermeneutic is critical of the way that colonial scholars in the past and even present, Western scholars, the dominant interpretations. And she asks Asian women, and she says Asian women are and should continue to offer critical evaluations of those interpretations, and perhaps even evaluate or offer a different reading. She wants to take a look also using historical critical methods and noting the context both of the Bible itself as other, but also the context of the theologian is writing within. She highlights a socio-political reading of various texts, and she brings up the story of the Syrophoenician woman or the Canaanite woman. And I encourage you to take a look at that as an example of her use of the post-colonial theory and hermeneutic to critique the Western hegemony. I suggest that you evaluate that or think about that clearly. Further, she highlights the importance of storytelling, how stories are told, the Bible stories are told orally, and also interpreted orally, that people will tell stories that are taken from the Bible, maybe add some things that they think would have been in there, or highlight different elements of it. And lastly, the notion of the Bible or scripture as performance. She looks at Na, N-O-H, I'm not sure that's how you pronounce it, but the dance, which is a drama that originated, she says, in a farming community in Japan, where there are performances and rituals that depict stories about the gods and ancestors. And she looks at how this traditional art form has been adapted, or how biblical storytelling has adapted this traditional art form, I should say. And she gives us an example of the life of Mary Magdalene and her encounter with Jesus in this similar, in that using the Na performance, dance, drama context. And we'll move on for the next reading, and we'll have a student lead our discussion and presentation about this. So this will be shorter, but I encourage you to think about these issues as well. I've already talked about the religious pluralism that's present in Asia and is an important part of the context of Asian religion. And this pluralistic reality affects a variety of different ways we think about God, and the variety of ways in which we practice, or how anybody thinks about God, how these people, how these women particularly think about God, and how these women practice. There's a question of whether or not you have dual or multiple religious commitments. There's the question of female representations of the divine. In Asia, there are a lot of different female representations of the divine, partially because there is a variety of different representations of the divine. not simply one. There is some monotheism, but there's also Hinduism and different avatars, and the female and male principles are both important, and the balance between the female and the male energies within the body and within the community are held up and important. And how does that affect our language about God? How does it affect our language about gender? How do we think about that language? These all have implications more broadly than Asian feminist theology. But this is a great way to focus our attention and highlight the questions here. Another question that is addressed in terms of religion and how the pluralistic context affects these answers has to do with the ecological issues, the importance of nature, the connectedness between the divine and the earth. In many Asian religions, there is a connection between the mountain and the lake and the river and the ocean and the trees, the Bodhi tree you might recall from Buddhism, and the connectedness between divine energy and the earth as opposed to a kind of separation or dualism. This leads me to the issue of divine immanence versus transcendence. Is God within us or God beyond us or God both? And which one do we emphasize? Is that immanence internal to a self in terms of the spirit, or is it internal to the world? Is God present in the mountain? Is God present only in the sky? Is God a creative power, creative power of life, like chi or prana and ren? Shakti is the Vedic principle of feminine creativity, and that is highlighted in Kwok Kulong's discussion of Asian feminist theology. In the next chapter, she talks about Christology and salvation. Using her post-colonial hermeneutic, she's concerned that salvation that focuses on an individual soul after death becomes the norm, and that's a problem. Instead, redemption needs to be both personal reconciliation with God and a liberation from the variety of bondages that Asian women experience and that Asians experience. Salvation is about shalom, peace, well-being, prosperity for the whole community. It is life-giving, not death-affirming. Jesus' suffering in this context in Asia is particularly powerful, both as a symbol and a claim that God, Jesus, is suffering with the suffering of the oppressed, that Jesus is suffering what the Korean notion of Han, which is the suffering of those who are poor and oppressed, those who are victims of injustice, those whose voices are not heard. But Jesus suffers with us, with them, hears their voices, and liberates himself and liberates them. Jesus as being a liberated person is important. It's important for his life and ministry, his healing, but also his resurrection, his passion that does not lead to death forever, but rather resurrection. Jesus is also highlighted his prophetic notion of concern for the poor and the oppressed and liberating the poor and the oppressed. God is seen as suffering with and being in solidarity with women. The questions of whether Jesus was God and man are not relevant in an Asian context. Rather, she says that we highlight the organic metaphors from the Bible and the tradition, the vines and the branches, the sheep and the shepherd, in the inclusiveness of banquets, the bread that gives life, the rice that might give life. Also, wisdom Christology is highlighted, wisdom of Sophia, which is feminine in the Hebrew, and is highlighted, the feminine notions of divine in the Hebrew Bible. This brings us to the importance of Jesus answering and addressing the context, particularly of Korea, of Han. Han, she says, Jesus is seen in Korea as a priest of Han, a priest that engages the Minjin theology, that is concerned about the suffering of the oppressed. Han, she says, this is on page 87 and 88. It's a Korean word that expresses deep feelings that arise out of the experience of being oppressed, out of the feelings of hopelessness, the feeling of unresolved resentment against unjustifiable suffering. The Han also arises out of a socio-political and economic oppression. The Han of women arises out of that, plus arises out of the rigid sexual discrimination in Korean society. When women are ridden with Han, many women seek the help of shamans. And a shaman is a priest of Han. So Jesus then is playing some of the roles of the shaman. And the priest exercises the Han through powerful dances and rituals. And this restores a person's health and strength and hope. The release of the Han involves three important steps. It involves the person who has the Han to speak and be heard, naming the source of oppression, and to participate in actively changing the unjust situation so that the person and persons can have healing. The third is to actively change these unjust situations. Shamanism, that's the bird, I guess she's feeling unjust. The shamanism is often a women-centered religious stratum, she says stratum, that provides the ritualistic language, practice, and imagination. And many Korean feminists use this language to express their Christian religious experience as well. Here, she says, sin is understood as wrongdoing for which one is responsible. And Han captures the feeling of being sinned against. So we have both the sin and the experience of being sinned against being addressed here. When we think of when she talks about Jesus as being a Han, or he's kind of more like a shaman, or he is like a shaman. The elements of his work of healing and care are highlighted. His Messiah is one of practice of healing, and he exercises Han. He exercises evil. And restores wholeness to the individual and the community. And this is exactly what the shaman does. And so she highlights those images of Jesus from the Bible and his teachings of right living as well, his subversive wisdom. And she highlights the way that God has compassion on all humankind, and that Jesus's death and passion is about the context of struggle for justice for all, not just himself. Next, we can talk about women in the church. there are lots of challenges that Asian women bring to the patriarchal church. Christianity has a lot of misogyny. We can talk some more about that, but Asian women are not the only ones to experience that, of course. But the Asian culture's view on purity and taboo, and often the highlighting that proper Asian women are chaste, contributes and merges with the misogyny of the patriarchal church. She still suggests, she says that women are still struggling to be ordained, even though there's a lot of discipleship. Women play a lot of roles. There are some denominations that do ordain women, but a lot of them, a lot of the churches in Hong Kong and in Asia object to it. One of the things that she talks about on page 108 are opponents to women's ordination cite the following reasons. Well, the created order says that women are created after men, and so they have to play a subordinate role. So that's a bunch of BS, isn't it? Yes. But Asian men are not the only ones to make that argument. Further, it says the reason why they don't want women to be ordained is because husbands are supposed to be the head of the wife, and thus it's not appropriate for a woman to lead. They cite Paul about this. Paul, if only you knew what problems you were causing. The third point is that women's nature is not suitable for ministry. This one I think needs some explanation from the opponents. I've heard it before, and I often think, what are you talking about? But I'm not going to go there. I'll let you guys go there. The fourth is that the tradition of the church does not allow women to be ordained. So since we have to do everything the tradition says, we have to keep women out of the ordained ministry. Now, she argues against these, and I think you'll recognize some of similar arguments that people have had in the West that argue that women ought to be able to be ordained, and many religions, many Christian denominations in the West do ordain women, but not all. She suggests that Asian feminist theology needs to argue for equal partnership, and we need to rethink leadership. What does it mean to be a leader in the church? What does it mean to be a leader in a community? Is it possible that leading is more about power with than power over? And what are some non-hierarchical leadership models? And I'm curious if you might reflect upon non-hierarchical leadership models that you've experienced or that you might take and apply to your own context.
Hi, I'm back. So for this last slide, dealing with the last section that's on sexuality and spirituality, I thought I would speak myself here. She has a very nice poem that she's written that she begins this section with. We see the spirit in the ancient gong, calling us to silence, to listen, to the embryonic rhythm of life, vibrating and resounding, all embracing. She goes on to talk about water, fire, the circle of dance, colors, our bonding with each other. To see spirituality everywhere and in all that we do. She begins this last chapter. There are 3 sections. The first one is about nature and women. So the question here is, are women closer to nature? So there's a woman named Sherry Ortner who wrote a while ago, the question, is female to male like nature is to culture? And that has been hotly debated. Part of the argument has been that women seem to be more attentive to nature. They seem to be more aware of our connection to nature. And many of the persons who are interested in ecology and environmental issues have been women. Rachel Carlson is one of the first to argue about that, the Silent Spring. Some of you may have read that. Further, in this section, she talks about that, and we've already discussed a little bit about the way in which, does that mean that women are essentially closer to nature, and since they're closer to their bodies, while men are closer to culture and the abstractions that often come with, that we interpret, or not interpret, but associate with culture. And the question here is no. It may be that women are more in tune with the important environmental issues of health, the health of all people, the health of nature, of water, of air, of the birds, as well as our own bodies, partially because, particularly in third world countries, it's women who are the ones who are responsible for this kind of work, of keeping the family safe, of keeping the community safe, of noting what's going on day to day, how the water's changed, how the environment has changed, how it's harder to get connection, how it's harder to get the food that one needs. She talks about the way in which Asia does not have the kind of focus on environmental health, and that's a problem. And so women and girls, typically their needs and their understandings go unheeded. In the next section, she talks about sexuality, and she argues that sexuality and sensuality are necessary parts of spirituality, and that we need to change the way that we've thought about spirituality, particularly as Christians. Often Christians have thought about spirituality as something that's unrelated to sensuality or sexuality. In fact, almost even the opposite. One can be spiritual or one can be sexual. You can't be both. But here she's arguing that sexuality, which she says is a gift from God and is about deep communion between individual people that care deeply about each other, that it is definitely a part of our spirituality, enhancing our spirituality, and our spirituality, that deep interconnection, enhances our sexuality as well. And we'll see that the uses of the erotic when we read Audre Lorde's, and that is on the lessons. If you want to read it now, it's a short but powerful piece that talks about sexuality and the eros, the power of the erotic, which is deeply interpersonal. And that's in the lesson at the end of our class. She also talks about the issues of gays and lesbians, and she has a really nice, she highlights this creed that has been created, kind of modeling on the Apostles' Creed from the 10% Club, that's engaging in an affirmation of LGBTQ persons and their sexuality and humanness. In the last section, she talks about something called spirituality for life, sorry. And spirituality for life seems to be a nomenclature, something that she wants to focus on. She's naming it as spirituality for life, which is why I have it capitalized. And she engages several elements in this spirituality for life. The first one is that our spirituality must be centered on all life, not just on humans. The next is that it should attend to social justice issues. Feminist needs to focus on social action as well as individual and environmental issues. And in fact, environmental issues and social justice issues are interconnected. This spirituality for life also challenges this consumerism that has gone crazy, and we've all seen this, where everybody go out and buy things and be patriotic as if that's what living in a democracy is about.
she's critiquing that notion, and she says that it's something that we've absorbed. They've absorbed, the Asian women have absorbed from Western culture. Instead, she says, let's look at living a life that is holistic and healthy, a simple life. The last one is to celebrate the diversity of religious experiences and creative spiritualities. There's a variety of different religious experiences and different experiences in general of the sacred, but to celebrate the diversity of that. Thank you. That's the end of the PowerPoint on Asian feminist theology, and we'll see you in Zoom.